record this? Okay. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Nicholas Royle to Birkbeck, to the first of our series on literature and politics at the Research Centre of, what are we called? CFFCS, Centre for French Francophone and Comparative Studies. And sorry about the weather. I put Adam in charge of the weather, and he went all Mancunian on me. No. But actually, what Adam did do was put me in touch with Nicholas, which was really, really good of him. So thank you. So Professor Royle, is. I know someone called Nicholas Boyle, and it's been really difficult for me.
I know people called Nicholas Royle.
Oh, that must be very confusing.
Yeah.
Anyway, Professor Royle is Emeritus Professor of English at Sussex, where he established the MA in Creative and Critical Writing, which is something that we now have as well, isn't it? And an author of many books, both fiction and non-fiction. Today, very recently, he's published Hélène Cixous, Dreamer, Realist, Analyst writing, about which I hope we're going to hear. But he's also the author of several novels, for instance, An English Guide to Birdwatching. And did Cixous not love that? She seemed to have written something about that. So there is some connection there. Also, yes, various works on critical works on English literature and on theory, Derrida, the uncanny, and indeed Cixous. So it's a real treat to have you here, and I'm going to hand over to you. But thank you so much again for coming.
Thank you very much, Connie. Thank you everybody for coming out in the rain, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm giving a talk with the somewhat strange sounding title, perhaps, Millions of a Species of Mole Never Known Before, reading with Hélène Cixous. And what I'm going to do is read a short paper, which I think is sort of 25 minutes maybe. And before I read the paper, I'm just going to make a few remarks about the book that published, in fact, 5 years ago. It came out in 2020, right on the eve of the pandemic, at the best possible moment, really. And I'm very touched to be able to report that this is the very first time anyone has invited me to say anything about it. So 5.5 years later, here I am, very happy to speak on the subject of this book, and to say maybe first of all that the book itself was a slow burner. I mean, it was 17 years in the making. It began somewhere around 2003, and then it wasn't the only thing I was doing for 17 years, but it was a slow process of putting the book together. It's got a cover that I love, a Rembrandt, which I don't know if anybody's ever seen this painting in IRL, as people say nowadays. It belongs to the Duke of Buccleuch, and I had dealings with the Duke of Buccleuch in order to get permission to put it on the cover. Old Woman Reading is the title for it. Rembrandt 1655, and when Hélène Cixous saw it, she said, as you might imagine, people will think it's me. But of course it's not. And there is, in fact, on the paperback edition, a photograph of Cixous. And if anybody's going to get hold of the book, if they are looking to acquire a copy, I would warmly recommend the paperback, because the paperback also has an afterword by Cixous, which the hardback doesn't have.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I say a little bit about this book. It really came together, I suppose, when I was thinking about Rembrandt and reading an essay by Cixous on, specifically, I suppose, focusing on a Rembrandt drawing the beheading of John the Baptist, which I don't know if anybody is familiar with that drawing, but I can perhaps pass it around later if anybody wants to see it. There's an essay by Cixous on this drawing, focusing on it, which argues, well, among other things, I suppose, I quote from Cixous, there is no end to writing or drawing. Being born doesn't end. Drawing is being born. And I've been interested for a long time in the relationship between writing and drawing, and this particular sketch by Rembrandt is incredible because it shows the beheading of John the Baptist before and after in the same sketch. So it's a very sort of temporally peculiar piece of work. The subtitle to the book is Dreamer, Realist, Analyst, Writing. And that title came to me after I had dinner with Hélène Cixous in early June 2017 in Paris. I met her in her apartment, and just before we went to a local Lebanese restaurant that she's very fond of, she said, "We need pens and paper." And literally, I stuffed a couple of pens in each pocket and paper, and we got to the restaurant and we didn't need any of these things. But it was what I think triggered my thought of a book that would somehow acknowledge and do something with Cixous' love of drawing as well as writing, and the play of the letter in all sorts of respects. So, as maybe you have already picked up, the acronym of the subtitle is DRAW. Dreamer, Realist, Analyst, Writing, and so drawing is in the title of the book. Perhaps I could say something about the different terms of the subtitle, the different words in that subtitle. The Dreamer, well, if you have not come across it, one of the most strange books, I think, by Cixous is a little book called Dream, I Tell You, which is a collection of her dreams, written down as soon as she wakes up. So, as far as possible, she claims, without repression kind of kicking in or whatever. And that book has a remarkable foreword, which is only a few pages long, but includes a number of, I think, extraordinary formulations about the relationship between dreaming and writing. She talks about Freud in that in the big opening pages of the book as the Shakespeare of the night, and set me off, I suppose, on because a fair amount of the book is about reading Shakespeare, especially dreams in Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra and elsewhere. The dreams that we have that maybe are more haunting, more kind of, they're unlike any other kind of dream, are dreams of the dead, right? And I don't know, I imagine that many of you here have had dreams of beloved, dead family or friends. And what happens in a dream when someone who is dead is resurrected is a particular fascination of Cixous. And she talks about the magic corridors of the night where you meet again this person who has come back. And having lost her own father when she was just 10, I think her father has a big part to play in her dreams and in these particular kinds of dreams. She's interested in dreams in terms of the play of words, the return of the dead, but also philosophy, and I guess her characterization of Jacques Derrida's work, again, is quite singular. So the books that she's written, there are several books by Cixous about Derrida. I think they all, in one way or another, are trying to testify to the idea that Derrida is a dreamer philosopher. And she says in one of her books, he's the only one. He's the only, dreamer philosopher. Is how she reads Derrida. The realism, the realist in the title, is again a kind of she hates realism, and this is one thing that she'll say in interviews. I hate realism. So a little bit of a provocation to suggest that she's a realist. But what I'm interested in is, I suppose, her intense fascination with the everyday, with everyday objects and everyday events or experiences, and how in her writing they, I think, quite consistently get kind of inflected or coloured by a certain hallucinatory intensity. So that, yes, this is real, but there's something of the fantastic, I think, going on all the time in her writing on everyday events like, walking into a shop or getting your mother to do something with the beans or whatever it might be. So this is what actually led Derrida in his, I think, marvellous book about Cixous, HC for Life, to talk about her hyperrealism. And I suppose there's an interesting sort of question about, Cixousian hyperrealism as distinct perhaps from other kinds of hyperrealism. But the way in which I suppose I would read it is in relation to this sense of the hallucinatory and fantastic and mortality. So, hello. I thought I would maybe read a little bit a sentence from something that she says. That what she's interested in is the experience of reading a book in which the mortality of the writer and reader are pushed up together as if in an unfolding accident, where there is no feeling of assurance that the author, any more than character or reader, is in control of what is befalling. And she calls this the reality, the secret of writing. I think that reality is something that all of her work in one way or another is striving for, is interested in. Analyst, so she has never been in analysis, like Jacques Derrida never was in analysis, but deeply interested in Freud especially, and worked, as perhaps Joe and others know, as a kind of go-between between Derrida and Lacan in Lacan's reading of Joyce, for example. So she's very knowledgeable, she's extremely astute, I think, in all matters to do with analysis, and one of the ways in which I want to try to read her in the book is as an analyst. So it's partly headed up by a remark that Adam Phillips made a few years ago. He said, psychoanalysis is too new for anyone to quite know what it is yet. And I think that sense of the sort of freshness of psychoanalytic thinking is something which is important for reading Cixous. Freud is memorably described by Cixous on one occasion as the greatest and most inspiring of puppets in my theatre. So it's not a reverential reading of Freud, but it's a very loving and very creative and interesting one, I think. And like many other thinkers, I suppose, she is particularly struck, and she has a great essay on this, by the idea of analysis as a kind of magic. So that phrase, a kind of magic, is one that Freud uses in his essay on psychoanalysis in conversation with a lay person. He refers to psychoanalysis as a kind of magic. A kind of magic in that sense that actually there is something therapeutic that happens through words, through being with somebody in a room, through listening or speaking. Writing, finally, just I'd say as drawing, thinking about the extent to which Cixous' thinking of writing is bound up with Derrida's thinking of writing. I suppose, first of all, in terms of what she refers to as the divisibility of the point. She uses that phrase in one of her books on Derrida. That's all Derrida is really about, the divisibility of the point. There is no point. There's only divisibility of the point. Right? And I think that's something which she shares with Derrida in a profound way, a commitment to an affirmation of the divisibility of the point. And I guess another, for me, guiding thought from Derrida in terms of Cixous' writing would be that kind of aphoristic formulation of grammatology where Derrida says, writing opens the field of history. So writing is what, in some sense, makes history possible. Right? So all of the interest in telling a story, which Cixous has and Derrida doesn't, at least he claims not to, is, I think, bound up with that same kind of interest in history, narrative, what happened. The main difference, I guess, between Cixous and Derrida that I try to bring out in the book is the sort of point that Derrida makes in his book about Cixous when he says she writes by dream. So this idea of writing by dream is something that I try to explore throughout the course of the book. So that's a sort of very rough summary of the interests of the book, and doesn't go into any of the sort of subject matter of different chapters, but that's the kind of terrain I'm trying to explore. All of this is preliminary to reading this little essay. The first time I encountered Cixous was at a conference at a chateau in Normandy at Cerisy in 1997, which was the Derrida conference on the autobiographical animal. So I don't know if any of you know the Derrida text, the animal that therefore I am. This was initially delivered at Cerisy in 1997. I didn't speak to Cixous on that occasion, and she didn't speak to me, so we were silently present to one another, I guess. But I did hear her read in the granary in the chateau one night, and I don't know, I'm sure many of you will have heard Cixous read. I was really amazed, I was deeply struck by the beauty of her voice, especially with the sense of the child in her voice. And indeed, it's a kind of consistent refrain in her writing. She'll say every morning, "I am a little girl." Right. So this idea of the child in Cixous is very important to me too. The text that I read at Cerisy was called Mole. And this seems to have been the principal reason, I don't know, why we have found ourselves as friends talking about moles on a very regular basis and addressing, well, I mean, she addresses me as Mole, so I'm landed with this designation. Yeah, I call her Mole too, so that's just how it goes. And in fact, the afterword to this book is all about the mole, and that's what this short paper is going to be about, which I will now read. So it hasn't been published yet. It's coming out next month in a book called Understanding Cixous, Understanding Modernism, edited by Peggy Camuff, published by John Wiley. And I start off this little text with a quotation from Keats, which is on your handout, if you have the handout. So there's a quotation from Isabella. "Who hath not loitered in a green churchyard, and let his spirit, like a demon mole, work through the clayey soil and gravel hard, to see skull, coffined bones, and funeral stole, pitying each form that hungry death hath marred, and filling it once more with human soul." Keats's remarkable question in Isabella tunnels directly into the Cixousian. Like Cixous, Keats is in rapport with small, non-human creatures. The mole, like a demon mole, corresponds with Keats's celebrated remark about the sparrow. "If a sparrow come before my window, I take part in its existence and pick about the gravel." The form of Keats's question in Isabella foreshadows his ode to autumn. "Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor." Both instances imply that we know the answer. It's obvious. Everyone has seen or done this. But who hath not loitered in a green churchyard and let his spirit like a demon mole work is weird. A considered response might be, such loitering is by no means widespread. Or more precisely perhaps, this is what poets do. Poets or poetic thinkers who understand the need to be close to the earth and who aspire to being a physician to humanity, to echo Keats's phrase. Keats's lines in Isabella are Cixousian in their immersion in the work of poetic thinking, in their concern with the spectral and uncanny, in their sensuous, erotic language, and their attention to physical texture, touch, and feeling, in their angling around certain modes of loitering. We would have to open up a new tunnel here to pursue the rich veins of connection, for example, between Cixous' The Laugh of the Medusa and the palely loitering figure undone by the fairy's child in Keats's La Belle Dame sans merci, in their peculiar fantasizing of pity and soulful resurrection, and in their shared but singular mad identification with a mole. The mole is a figure of writing itself. This idea is made most vivid by Franz Kafka, Cixous' closest literary kin in a so-called modernist context. The village schoolmaster, also known as the giant mole, begins by recalling a giant mole that was observed a few years back in the neighbourhood of one of our villages. The mole is described in Kafka's opening sentence as having once been observed, but everything after that is assiduously, deliriously given over to consideration of the writings by the schoolmaster and the narrator to which the sighting of this creature has given rise. The village schoolmaster is unfinished. A mole's work, it seems, is never done. This sense is still sharper in The Burrow, another unfinished text by Kafka that leads the reader down into tunnels and strange dangers that appear at once real. The mole-like narrator is feverishly, passionately concerned with the construction and efficacy of its burrow, and fantastic. The Burrow is a remarkable, disturbing, at moments hilarious account of the sheer, relentless, insatiable passion and pursuit of writing as such. The writer is like a mole. She may even be more mole-like than writerly. The mole marks the non-coincidence of the author with himself or herself. Veering in between or beyond himself or herself is also integral to Cixous' conception of the mole. As she suggests in her play, this is the references to these texts are at the bottom of the handout, The Blindfolded Fiancée, or Amélie, depending, I quote, depending on the hour and the mood, it's a boy or a girl mole. As in The Burrowing Creature in First Days of the Year, Jour de l'An, a book that is presented as a third-person account of the author. Quote, "Why do I speak of the author as if she were not me?" writes Cixous. "Because she isn't me. She departs from me and goes where I don't want to go. Often I sense she is my enemy. I write under the ground," she says, "like a beast, burrowing into the silence of my breast." This passage reverberates, if you're familiar with The Burrow, with the energies and allergies of Kafka's text, The Burrow. The writer might indeed resemble a mole, as in the case of E.M. Forster, who was dubbed the mole, the taupe in French, by Lytton Strachey on account of his furtiveness, the way he showed up in unexpected places. As Forster's biographer P.N. Furbank put it, there was something flitting and discontinuous about him. One minute you were talking with him intimately, the next he had withdrawn or simply disappeared. But this figuration of the mole, this toponym, is not so much about an identity as about difference, secrecy, interruption, deferral, disappearance. The mole is cryptic and other, inseparable from a conception of not I, something demonic, demon mole in Keats's phrase, possessed. The mole is a figure of blindness and the unforeseeable. Everything Cixous writes about the myopic can be read through the mole. The mole is thus also about reading as much as about writing. Cixous observes, "One must be endowed with myopia to dig, bury, undig the secret of texts, and to know how to make homonyms fructify. The sighted, she goes on, are moles with a muscular gaze. End of quote. One doesn't know what is going to happen. One can't see. The writer is constitutionally exposed to the unknown and unforeseeable. This includes, but is never limited to, the gifts and treasures that might turn up by chance or serendipity in what she calls the mines of language. As Marta Segarra puts it, true artists, for Cixous, do not foresee what they effectively do. Cixous writes, wisdom begins with knowing that we cannot stop ourselves being blind from believing we are what we are, while knowing that we know nothing of what we are. No other law except the unforeseeable, says Cixous. Appreciation of the workings of this law is indissociable from a reckoning with the writings of Jacques Derrida. Derrida's argument that unforeseeability conditions the very structure of the event goes along with his elaboration of what he regards as one of the most fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, namely the logic of Nachtraglichkeit. And that, for me, more or less unpronounceable word is on the handout as well, a term that has been variously translated into English as deferred effect, delayed action, after sense, I think is Henry James's rather beautiful word in this context. And Derrida in Archive Fever says, this is Freud's greatest discovery. It's not the Oedipus complex or any of that stuff. It's deferred effect. After a mole-like progression. This is Derrida's phrase in Freud and the Scene of Writing, referring to the workings of memory and the logic of the trace, a subterranean force of supplementary delay and deferred meaning that unsettles every present. Perception and experience are subject to the subterranean toil, I'm quoting Derrida from Freud and the Scene of Writing, of this kind of uncanny mole. The writer doesn't get to appropriate, domesticate, or team up with the mole. Cixous' books, all the singular works of tunnelling that have appeared more or less annually now for decades, live on, if you'll excuse me saying, borrowed time. Her narratives are intricate, expansive, digging, undigging, somersaulting adventures in the reality of the unforeseeable, of deferred effect and aftersense. There is a saying in French, allez visiter le royaume des taupes, to go visit the kingdom of moles, to die. The idiom is funny, partly because it implies, despite possible associations of clayey soil and gravel hard, to recall Keats, a reassurance of regality and sovereignty. We might instead call to mind what Derrida says about the logic of the trace, or différance. There is no kingdom, royaume, of différance, but différance instigates the subversion of every kingdom. The kingdom of moles is also funny in its suggestion of some shared space or community, whereas moles, in truth, are notably solitary creatures. In his beautifully strange evocation of moles as nature's mute monks, Samuel Taylor Coleridge doubtless plays on the etymology of monk, from the Greek monarchos, solitary, from monos, alone. Cixous' fascination with the mole has less to do with the kingdom of death and more with the kind of spectral, demonic, resurrectional associations evident in Keats's Isabella and indeed in Coleridge. She refers to Coleridge's limbo and his moles, nature's mute monks. In Medusa, I do my best to say this. This is a book published in 2022, which has just come out in English. It's Medeilm. Medeilm. A book that is pervaded by mole thinking and bears the subtitle Paroles de taupe. Peggy Camus translates this as mole speech. Other possibilities might include word of mole or mole saying. But in a sense, the French taupe is itself a translation in translation. The English mole is already at work in this parole. As Cixous has commented in her afterword to the book, the drawing book, I can only think of this word animal, mole, in English, because of its noble literary ancestry. The key figure in this mole ancestry is Shakespeare, and in particular the scene in Hamlet, in which Hamlet addresses the ghost. Well said, old mole, canst work i' the earth so fast, a worthy pioneer. Medusa, the title itself might suggest the somersaulting silhouette of a demon mole, is concerned with the ways in which the dead speak or write to us, in us, with us. As the narrator observes, the dead accompany me. I do not live without my dead. The dead write to me. Without writing, we would not have been able to exist or survive. End quote. Medusa reflects on the disinterring in 2020 of an obituary notice, ecology, for the death of Cixous' father, Georges, in February 1948. I quote, "The event of this year is the arrival of the notice, and afterwards the mystery of the life of the notice, a mole's life. One will thus have lived more than 70 years on earth, going, coming, growing and shrinking. Already the children of our children are forgetting us, have forgotten us, far off in time. Meanwhile, trampling beneath our steps this life that is so hidden beneath the immortal earth, meanwhile it digs, it will have dug, and it's on Wednesday, 29th of December 2020, that the mole surfaces at the end of a journey in the belly of the earth." Cixous' book goes on to elaborate on the ghostly, uncanny or fairy power of writing as she recounts the surfacing of fairy-like letters dictated by Georges Cixous but not known about for decades. Of this we are told, I quote, "Everything is said, and everything that is said is silenced and buried under the ground of forgetting where God the mole grave digs. Old mole, it's you, old mole and revered papa." Here the mole, the father, the ghost and Shakespeare come together. If God is a mole, she is irreducibly literary. A god at once of the earth and the fantastic. We may recall Cixous' emphatic point of discrimination in a 1996 interview she says that she is religiously atheistic, but literarily deistic. Medusa follows its own mole-like progression, acknowledging that it is impossible to be present to the present, while exploring the double bind that the dead who are nothing without us are our masters. The word Medusa is a cryptic toponym, a ghostly mole word that comes from Shakespeare, as heard or translated by Victor Hugo in one of his table-turning experiments on the 23rd of January 1854. Cixous' book resurrects it, lets it speak, puts it to work as never before. Medusa is a book set in the 2020s, in this time of plagues and burning darkness, which in its digging and undigging of the past and in its insistence of the effects of mole speech, opens onto moments to come. This is Cixous' word. Just after Old Mole, It's You, the narrator is described as having let out, breathed, pushed on, dug, aroused, provoked, a molement. Puisser un molement. Moment is Cixous' Alice-like portmanteau of the mole and the moment, and what might be meant by mole. In its provocation and play, in its push for a future, this moment recalls how the mole is crucial to the way in which Cixous, some 50 years earlier, had conceived the deconstruction of logocentrism and the emergence of a world in which phallocentrism has crumbled. And I quote from Sortes, "So all the history, all the stories would be there to retell differently. The future would be incalculable. The historic forces would change, will change, hands and body. Another thought as yet unthinkable will transform the functioning of all society. We are living in this time where the conceptual foundation of an age-old culture is in the process of being undermined by millions of a species of mole never known before." Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was going to ask about that title, and then you ended on the quotation. So that's perfect. But I'm now full of. I was going to say mulling. I'm not sure whether that should be moling. I'm still mulling over things. But I do have some questions. Does anyone want to start? Do you have any? Is anyone? Yeah, Damien, please.
Yeah, thanks for your paper. It's been very rich, very interesting. I'm just wondering, this is just a speculative question, really. Mole, whether in English or French, also means a spy. Someone who infiltrates
in the sense that it's a fairly recent meaning. It's like, I think 1953 maybe the first recorded usage. So it's not, you can't go back to Shakespeare and start talking about mole in that sense. But obviously the figure of the mole, in a sense, always already comports or invites this thinking of secrecy and furtiveness and turning up in unexpected places, to quote the Furbank line on E.M. Forster. There are, of course, other senses of mole, the fortification sense of mole, which interests me quite a bit, and I talk about in the Uncanny, in the book called The Uncanny. And in Hamlet, of course, it's very striking, I think, that Hamlet refers to his father as mole, really quite close to the moment where he talks about the vicious mole in nature. where you're talking about a mole as a mark on the body. So there's that sense of mole also in play in Shakespeare. But yes, I mean, the suggestions, I suppose, of the mole didn't in some ways have to wait till 1953, but you know.
Mm-hmm. Just a quick question about the title of your book. Is it writing? There's dreamer, analyst, and that writing. Is it because of écriture or what?
Yeah,
why
I mean,
is it?
I wanted to sort of be a little bit sort of to interrupt the sense of descriptive nouns that, you know, we can think of her as these things.
Mm-hmm.
No, because it's not. I think, you know, she's fascinated by the nature of what we call autobiography, but it seems to me that she's also just as much or even more fascinated by the impossibility of autobiography and the ways in which that auto is hetero. So for me, having writing in the title is a way of, I suppose, signalling or gesturing towards something less personal and
Yes.
yeah.
Avoiding writer, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nick? Okay, Adam first and then
No,
Joe.
Joe, you go. I'll ask a very simple question, a very factual question, which is, I'd just like to ask about what genre of writing these works of Cixous belong to, or might belong to. Many of us will have encountered her in years past under the rubric of French theory, post-structuralism, French feminism. We read Sorties, and you know, we might remember her early work on Joyce, which was a kind of biography, as far as I remember, and then, you know, essays on Joyce. And we may think of her as a theorist or even a literary critic. But my sense from this paper is that really what you're talking about is other kinds of writing, which might be more like what is called creative writing or memoir, philosophical meditation. I'm not sure. So can you suggest in what genres the writing might belong to?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a lovely question. An important question, but not one to which I have a satisfying answer, I don't think. Derrida, when Cixous sent him her first book as a manuscript in the late 60s, recounts in his book Agency for Life, you know, what is this thing you know, that has kind of fallen like a meteor in my garden? And he goes on to coin the phrase unidentifiable literary object. And indeed, not that long ago, I think maybe 5 years or so ago, the journal Parallax did a special issue on unidentifiable literary objects. So that would be one term, but that's not a particularly sort of satisfactory one in terms of, you know, conforming to the kind of conventional identifications. But I think that's what she's doing, really. She's interested in writing that doesn't belong, and writing that in one way or another no doubt mixes genres, but is perhaps in the end unidentifiable. You know, I mean, I've got a couple of her drawings in the book. She sent me this lovely drawing in which she invented the word ornithophony. I don't know where it came from exactly, except I think probably something to do with an English guide to birdwatching. But the idea of anthropomorphism is one thing, and then there's what I've called ornithomorphism, where, you know, think about all the words in English, for example, which actually are about birds, and it's about us being birds, even if we don't, as it were, explicitly register it as such. And ornithophony is the word that I think she's proposing as a way of thinking about how bird speech or bird song might be part of writing. You know, I mean, that wouldn't belong to a genre, except, you know, in some ways it's everywhere in, you know, in English and so many other literatures. The ornithophonic, or something, yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, can we take Adam first and then, yeah.
No, I'll go second because it's kind of more, I'm more like free associating, so it might not produce anything, so absolutely. Don't forget it.
Thanks for your lovely, thanks for your lovely talk, and it was a bit of a ray of sunshine in this really miserable day. I don't know if I'm taking you out of your comfort zone, because my reading of Cixous is stuff from 20 years ago, and my interest is la Shelley française, so I'm going to ask her opinion, but I do appreciate it might not be your comfort zone. So the two works of hers that I've been looking at are Realism d'une femme sauvage and Stigmata, both of which I adore.
Yeah.
A lack of, not syntax, obviously, syntax is wonderful, but a lack of punctuation. And being a child of the 70s, it really resonates very well with me. She makes up sentences as it suits her. The question, however, is the following. So Stigmata is all about, well, having been stigmatised as a Jew and having been very badly treated in Algeria. And basically most of the essays resonate with that issue. And I personally find it brilliant. But I'm just wondering, because I haven't read the stuff 20 years on, because that's my area of research. Has she settled on an identity, or is this still a crisis for her? Because through Stigmata and Realism d'une femme sauvage, I mean, I love it because of the crisis, and because I suppose I identify with it, because, you know, I'm a displaced Mancunian, so obviously big issues in my life.
Right.
But I just wonder, you know, 20 years on, has she settled on an identity, or is it still very problematic? Or is that an unfair question, because you're looking at it from your English point of view, whereas I'm looking at it from the Franco-Machiavellian point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Thank you. It's a really interesting question, and I love Stigmata and the Savage Woman. I can't remember how it's translated into English, but that text is also richly interesting, and I talk about both texts quite a bit in the book. So but they're very important to me. Maybe there's a certain kind of pathos in the idea of an identity crisis, which isn't entirely right for her. I don't know. I tend to think, you know, it's like, again, like Derrida. Derrida will say there is no identity. There are movements of identification. Identity is always to come in some sense. It's bound up with a thinking of the promise, I suppose. But I think she's still writing her crazy texts. Yeah, I mean she goes on producing them, at least one book a year.
But perhaps identity isn't such an issue anymore, since she's burrowing down into moleland. Perhaps she's left the issues with identity 20 years previously.
Yeah, I mean I think she's often writing books that go back into her childhood, so back into Algeria and all of the sorts of things that you've referred to.
Yeah.
They don't go away,
No.
but she will, I think, quite consistently link them to the reading of something, whether it would be, you know, Lispector or you know, a children's writer, or the Victor Hugo stuff on Shakespeare and table turning, and yeah, documents like the letters from her father which have come to light, you know, that this sort of strange return of the past. I think she's, you know, unlike, as I said, mentioned earlier, unlike Derrida, who claimed never to know how to tell a story, I think Cixous is deeply interested in telling stories.
Yeah.
And that interest in telling stories is one that is, you know, that's the kind of energy and passion of reading her, that you do get, in fact, caught up in some kind of narrative. But often it involves temporal loops or kind of surprises where actually the most important thing about this text is something that happened 40 years earlier and gets announced only on page 120.
But do you think she settled on a French identity?
No.
You don't?
No, I don't. I think she continues to be, well, to come back to Joe's question, you know, she strives to be unidentifiable. She's not interested in that whole kind of enclosure, I suppose.
Thank you.
Adam, do you want to?
It's still perhaps free association or dream work. I'm struck by this kind of affirmatory writing. It strikes me that that's what we're kind of talking about, thinking about it as affirmatory writings. And it's just whether there's almost a moral politics that's linked to a kind of, well, other things as well. I mean, it perhaps requires a certain kind of writing. If there is a moral politics, which there might not be, I suppose. But I think what sparked that was not so much a reading. I don't know how Cixous fits in with this, and I've just realised I've now been mispronouncing a name with a Z rather than X. So there's X's and Z's here, which X is on the illustration of the dead man's eye, so I guess X is the symbol of death there perhaps. But the point really is about life and death and life, so a politics of life as opposed to a politics of death. I suppose that might be what it is. But an engagement which may or may not be useful, because this is, I think, probably a free association around the idea of an affirmatory writing and a kind of legacy of French theory, but with the Anglophone, well, what could we call the Anglophone? I'm thinking of Gillian Rose's Mourning Becomes the Law, where mourning as a working through, and thus as a kind of an affirmation of a new form of life after death, if you like, is linked to, I think, a somewhat unfair criticism of mainly Brontë, I think, rather than Derrida, but Derrida is brought into, I think, a charge that Rose is making against a certain writing, a certain philosophical voice that in the end cannot become political. It's too obsessed, it's too concerned, this is too crude, but it's too concerned with death rather than life. It's got no, I think what she calls kind of almost like a doctrine of experience, because politics requires experience, it requires the everyday, which I think that would link to the Cixousian voice, which is an engagement with the everyday. Rather like Engels is to bring Manchester in, why not? The tradition of the working class in England is very much a book about the everyday, about what it's like to be in a city at a particular time, but it also invokes something that's not there in the text, but should be, so it is an affirmatory writing. It's a moral politics, a dream politics, of a justice, forgive the phrase, a justice yet to come. I think it's a justice in the city to kind of try and play Gillian Rose off against that kind of avenir, the to come and go, what have you. So how, if there is a moral politics, how does it relate to an affirmatory writing? How does it perhaps relate to not just writing, but experiences as well, as a way of thinking through experience, whether those experiences are dreamed experiences or lived experiences, political experiences. I'm sorry, I know this is slightly rambling, but it's this quality of the light and
as the afternoon goes on.
I'm hoping it's a celebration of the energies that your paper has liberated, which seem to me so exciting. So, moving in so many. directions simultaneously. I hope that it's more of a kind of a sense of provocations that I feel, not provocations in a good sense, that emanate from the energies of the play.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, it's a long time since I read Gillian Rose's book. So I think we probably have to save that conversation for another time. I mean, I guess, you know, there are. I mean, it's in some ways, you know, like the classic question, isn't it? Well, is there a mole politics? So,
It's a classic question, yes.
It's a classic question. Maybe it's never been posed quite like that before. For me, and this is, I suppose, you know, how I read Derrida, how I read Cixous, there are all sorts of affinities between the mole and what Derrida talks about in Spectres of Marx as the new international. Yeah, secretive, underground, anonymous, and yeah. Mentioning the light, though, also put me in mind of the whole kind of experience of twilight, which is another major zone for me in thinking about Cixous. Yes, that would be for another day too.
Yes, go ahead.
A couple of maybe quite speculative things to say. The first one would be the nocturnality of the mole. I think that is something that is very interesting in relation to some of the things you were talking about, and maybe you could expand on that. And the second thing that's occurred to me, and I don't really know these texts because I've not been able to read them anywhere or see the production, but I'm thinking, for example, of Cixous' collaborations with
I guess the idea, I mean, maybe this picks up also on a response to Joe's question earlier, you know, for thinking about the genre of the writing, that Cixous has this essay called Writing Blind, which is, I think, one of my favourite of her short texts, which it doesn't matter if it's night or day. She says, you know, I close my eyes, I night. And then that's what writing blind, that's where writing blind begins. So maybe this, you know, in part this twilight is, of course, I mean, I love this word in English because it's got two in it. So twilight is two lights, right? It's neither one nor the other, and both one and the other. And I suppose I think of the mole as more a twilight creature than a nocturnal one, if that's a helpful formulation. The theatre question, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've seen, I saw the most recent Russian Revolution piece in Paris earlier this year, and yeah, wonderful, amazing. First of three, supposedly. So, but I think Cixous is always thinking about Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare and Kafka are the two writers who most constantly inform what she does. And you know, I'm fortunate to have had, you know, a number of really, for me, fascinating conversations with her about Shakespeare. One or two of which have been published in the Oxford Literary Review. And I mean, I'm always amazed when I talk to her of how intimate she is with Shakespeare's language. I mean, it's not like. It's a bit like Joyce, actually. I mean, she's so inward with it. It's really remarkable.
take a couple more questions. Is that all
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Amanda, and then.
Thank you so much for the paper. It was really interesting. I'm sorry if my question is a bit half-baked, but I was thinking about the impossibility of autobiography and a choice to record your dreams. And that made me think about the idea of the mole digging tunnels that not always resurface.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of autobiography not as something that is on the surface, but like all the journeys that are like really deep in earth, and the idea of digging tunnels that are not necessarily utilitarian, like digging tunnels that don't need to lead anywhere, but they are journeys that the mole does take anyway. So the possibility of autobiography, finding a possibility for autobiography through the digging of the mole, and the idea of not going to the surface, and not being wildly interested in the surface of things, but more the working of the underground.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think the idea of the surface is really important, you know, in terms of what we've been speaking about. Those moments of eruption where this creature comes up, whether it's in the form of, you know, a signature, a molehill, or, you know, the work of a molehill, or actually coming above ground, which moles do. They do. They need water, but obviously it's relatively seldom. But I think that idea of surfacing is really, I like that, because in some ways it captures maybe something like the moment, you know, that I was talking about towards the end of the paper, of moments that erupt, unforeseen, and change everything. Yeah.
One more. Thanks.
I was revising Shelley Mazzini's poem Digging, if anyone's familiar with it, where basically the idea that after the death of someone close to you, he's got a metaphor of digging, where you have to work out how you process that grief, and there's almost a blindness to it. You have to dig down and repurpose that grief. I was interested in the idea that she lost a parent very young. That's something that's also happened to me, that you have to keep repurposing it and thinking, how are you going to deal with this? And as you go through your life, you keep remaking new images of it, and whether it's a real image or not, because you're so blind to what was, are you really making an image of what really was, or is it just something to cope with things? Because a mold is effectively just digging through the earth and repurposing it and pushing all that earth beyond you. You could view that earth as your own emotions, your own life, your own past.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the poetic resources of the mold are endless.
It's kind of, it also struck me as Keats is writing from an era, of course, when everyone was a lot closer to death, Memento Mori.
Yeah.
The era that everyone had, death was much more common, especially death for infants.
Yeah, I mean, the connection, the sort of link between the mole and death is ancient, and of course it's there in Shakespeare. You know, he's calling his father Old Mole. He's addressing his dead father. So there's poignancy, I think, in that too. Thank you.
Right. So one more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are there any Marxist takings on the connection between the mole and
Yeah.
16?
Yeah.
Marx also has a metaphor of the mole as a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, in the paper that I gave at Cerisy in 1997, the paper called Mole, there's quite a bit about Marx, and in particular Marx's appropriation of Shakespeare, where the figure of the mole is the figure of revolution. And Marx says, well-grubbed old mole. So in fact there's a sort of shift from speech maybe some notion of a performative, to digging and coming up with something presumably implicitly edible. But that figure of the mole is important for Marx as well, yeah. Yeah.
Do you call Hélène Cixous mole or taupe?
Mole.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes vole.
A vole? Oh.
Well, that's an anagram of love.
Yes.
So I do sometimes call her vole,
Right.
but it's usually just mole.
I'm sorry, I just have this image now I can't get out of my head of you calling each other mole. But thank you so much. Shall we? I don't know if there are any more. I don't want to sort of have too many questions, but I think we've maybe reached a natural end briefly. But thank you so much. That was very, very, very thought-provoking, clearly.
Thank you very much.
Apologies for the Mancunian element. But
well,
that's for another day.
I have my Mancunian element too.
And we have a bit more time if you've got a bit of time to chat. But that was really brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's actually Manchester University Press, isn't it, the book? Yes, is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, well, I like the fact that The Uncanny was published by Manchester and has a Rembrandt on the cover, so it's a sort of sister volume.